The emergency room fell silent only after the heart monitor began beeping again, but by then the damage had already been done. Dr. Richard Lawson slammed a clipboard onto the nurse's station so hard that pens scattered across the polished counter, his voice rising above the alarms, footsteps, and frightened whispers filling the trauma bay. Everyone heard him accuse the newest trauma nurse of acting beyond her authority, and everyone watched without saying a word as Evelyn Hayes stood perfectly still with a pair of bloodstained gloves in her hands, her shoulders relaxed, her expression unreadable despite the dozens of eyes fixed upon her. Just minutes earlier, a teenage boy had arrived after a devastating highway collision, unconscious, losing blood faster than anyone could replace it. The emergency department had erupted into organized chaos as respiratory therapists prepared ventilators, nurses connected monitors, surgeons rushed from operating rooms, and family members prayed from behind locked doors. During those frantic seconds, when hesitation could have become a death sentence, Evelyn had ignored protocol and ordered an emergency transfusion before the physician officially authorized it. She had recognized a subtle pattern hidden inside the patient's breathing, the color of his skin, and the rhythm of his pulse. Most people would have waited. She did not. The boy survived. Instead of gratitude, she received humiliation. Dr. Lawson pointed toward her with visible frustration, insisting that nurses followed orders rather than created them. He warned that if every nurse decided to practice medicine independently, hospitals would descend into chaos. His words echoed across the department while several younger staff members lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet Evelyn's gaze. A few exchanged uncomfortable looks because deep down they knew she had made the right decision. None of them spoke. Hospitals had their own hierarchy, and challenging a respected physician rarely ended well. Evelyn simply removed her gloves, folded them neatly, and placed them into the disposal bin without rushing. She apologized in a calm voice that surprised everyone because it carried no anger, no embarrassment, and no attempt to defend herself. It sounded almost as though she had been through something far worse than public criticism. Dr. Lawson interpreted her silence as admission of guilt. He informed her that hospital administration would review the incident immediately and suggested she begin preparing an explanation that might save her job. Around them, the emergency department slowly resumed its rhythm. Stretchers rolled through automatic doors. Phones rang. The smell of antiseptic mixed with fresh coffee drifting from the break room. Families waited beneath fluorescent lights that never seemed to dim, regardless of whether someone was celebrating life or mourning death. Evelyn quietly returned to checking medication carts as though nothing extraordinary had happened. One of the senior nurses, Linda Morales, approached her cautiously after ensuring no physicians were nearby. Linda had spent nearly 3 decades inside emergency medicine and believed she could usually read people within minutes. Evelyn remained the exception. There was something about the younger woman that never fit the picture everyone painted. She worked impossible shifts without complaint. She remembered every patient's name. She never panicked during disasters. Even more strangely, she never celebrated when praised or argued when blamed. Linda lowered her voice and asked the question she had wanted to ask for months. "Why did you do it?" Evelyn continued organizing syringes before answering. Because waiting another 20 seconds would have killed him. Linda searched her face for uncertainty, but found none. Instead, she found complete confidence, wrapped inside remarkable humility. It unsettled her more than arrogance ever could. Before Linda could ask anything else, the overhead speaker announced another incoming trauma, forcing everyone back into motion. The next several hours blurred together beneath the relentless pace only emergency departments truly understood. Elderly patients arrived struggling to breathe. Construction workers limped through automatic doors with broken bones. A frightened little girl clung to a stuffed rabbit, while doctors examined a deep cut across her forehead. Through every emergency, Evelyn moved with quiet precision. She anticipated supplies before anyone requested them. She noticed tiny changes in patients that others overlooked. She comforted anxious families with the same gentle tone regardless of whether they wore expensive suits or stained work boots. More than once another physician caught themselves following her recommendations before remembering she was supposedly only a nurse. During a rare 10-minute break, Evelyn stepped into the staff locker room. She opened a plain metal locker assigned to her 6 months earlier. Inside hung a neatly pressed spare uniform, a faded photograph of an older couple smiling beside a fishing boat, and a small velvet pouch tucked behind folded towels. She hesitated before opening it. Resting inside lay a worn bronze challenge coin engraved with an eagle above crossed medical insignias. Years of use had softened its edges until it almost felt smooth beneath her fingertips. She turned it over once before slipping it back into the pouch. Her phone vibrated quietly. The screen displayed no name, only a secure number she had not seen in nearly 4 years. She stared at it until the vibration stopped. No voicemail followed. She placed the phone face down inside her locker and closed the door without another glance. When she returned to the emergency department, she found hospital administrator Karen Whitmore waiting with folded arms. Karen informed her that a formal disciplinary meeting would take place before the end of the shift. Several department supervisors would attend, including Dr. Lawson. Evelyn thanked her politely and returned to preparing in 4-line for an elderly veteran whose trembling hands reminded her of someone she once knew. The old man noticed the way she adjusted his blanket before checking his pulse. He smiled weakly and said she carried herself like military. Evelyn paused for only the briefest moment before smiling back and saying she had learned discipline from good teachers. The veteran chuckled softly and replied that some habits could never be hidden. She wished him well before moving to the next patient, unaware that Linda had overheard every word. The comment lingered in Linda's mind far longer than expected. Hours later, just as the evening sun cast golden light through the hospital's glass entrance, the disciplinary meeting began inside a conference room overlooking the emergency department. Dr. Lawson presented his argument confidently, insisting that professional boundaries existed for a reason. Karen nodded while reviewing incident reports. Evelyn remained seated with folded hands, listening without interruption. Then a firm knock echoed through the room. Karen excused herself and opened the door, expecting another administrator. Instead, she found 2 individuals dressed in dark suits displaying official credentials. Their expressions were calm but unmistakably serious. One spoke with measured professionalism. "Good evening. We're looking for Captain Hayes." Karen frowned politely and replied that there must be some mistake because no captain worked at the hospital. The older agent glanced past her shoulder, locking eyes with Evelyn across the conference table. His expression softened with unmistakable recognition before he spoke again. "No mistake. We've been searching for Captain Evelyn Hayes, and it's extremely important that we speak with her immediately." Every head in the room turned toward the quiet nurse, who had spent the entire day being reminded that she was only a nurse, and for the first time since anyone had met her. Evelyn slowly closed her eyes, as though she had always known this day would eventually arrive. No one spoke after the words settled over the conference room, because disbelief has a way of silencing even the loudest people. Dr. Lawson stared at Evelyn as though the woman sitting across from him had somehow become a stranger in the span of a single sentence. Karen Whitmore looked from the 2 FBI agents to the nurse whose employment file contained nothing more remarkable than excellent evaluations, spotless attendance, and a recommendation from a military veterans hospital that had revealed almost nothing about her past. The older agent stepped inside with respectful restraint rather than authority, his partner quietly closing the door behind him. He addressed Evelyn not as a suspect, but as someone whose service had already earned his admiration. He asked if they could speak privately. Evelyn met his eyes for a long moment before giving a small nod, yet Karen immediately objected. Hospital policy required administrators to understand why federal agents were requesting one of their employees during working hours. Rumors alone could destroy reputations. The younger agent calmly assured her that Captain Hayes was not under investigation and had committed no crime. Those words should have settled the room, yet they somehow made everyone even more curious. If she was innocent, why would the FBI arrive in person asking for someone who supposedly did not exist? Evelyn slowly unclipped her hospital identification badge from her uniform and placed it carefully on the conference table. For a brief second, she simply looked at it, almost as though remembering the peaceful life it represented. Then she reached into her pocket and removed a slim leather wallet that no one had ever seen before. Inside rested an official military identification card bearing her photograph, the name Captain Evelyn Hayes, Medical Corps, and security markings that immediately changed the expressions of both FBI agents. They stood a little straighter without realizing it. Karen's lips parted in disbelief. Dr. Lawson leaned forward, reading the card twice before convincing himself it was real. Linda, who had quietly entered after hearing whispers outside the room, felt the veteran's comment from earlier echo inside her memory. Some habits could never be hidden. Evelyn gently closed the wallet and slipped it back into her pocket. She offered no dramatic explanation. She simply acknowledged what everyone else had finally discovered. Years ago, before she ever wore hospital scrubs, she had served in places most people would never see and under circumstances she could never discuss. She apologized for never mentioning it, explaining that she had signed agreements preventing her from revealing much of her previous service. There had been no intention to deceive anyone. She had only wanted to be known for the work she did now rather than the work she once performed. The older FBI agent introduced himself as Special Agent Daniel Mercer. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. He explained that certain classified records had recently been cleared for limited operational review after new intelligence surfaced overseas. Those records repeatedly referenced Captain Hayes by name because she had commanded a highly specialized medical extraction team during one of the most dangerous humanitarian operations conducted in recent military history. Around the conference table, no one interrupted. Even Dr. Lawson seemed unable to find words. Mercer continued carefully, choosing every sentence as though each carried weight beyond the room. Nearly 7 years earlier, a convoy transporting civilian doctors, aid workers, and orphan children had become trapped inside an active conflict zone. Armed groups had blocked every evacuation route, while communications collapsed one by one. Air support could not safely land. Ground rescue teams suffered heavy casualties attempting to reach them. Intelligence analysts believed everyone inside the convoy would be dead before sunrise. Captain Hayes volunteered for a mission that military planners privately described as nearly impossible. She assembled a small medical team, entered hostile territory under darkness, and reached the convoy hours before enemy forces closed the final escape corridor. During the operation, she treated wounded civilians while directing multiple evacuation vehicles through collapsing infrastructure without firing a single shot. When one bridge became unusable, she rerouted dozens of vehicles through abandoned villages that no satellite had identified as passable. She carried injured children across floodwater after ambulances became trapped. She refused evacuation until every civilian had crossed safely. Official reports later estimated that more than 60 innocent lives survived because of decisions she made under extraordinary pressure. Yet almost no one outside classified circles ever learned her name. Evelyn listened without pride. Her eyes remained lowered toward the conference table as though the memories belonged to someone else. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Many good people never came home. Please don't tell only my part of the story." The room fell into complete silence. No monitors beeped here. No phones rang. For several long seconds, no one even shifted in their chairs. That silence carried more emotion than speeches ever could. Linda watched tears gather in Karen's eyes. Even Dr. Lawson seemed unable to reconcile the composed nurse he had publicly embarrassed with the officer whose decisions had saved dozens of strangers. Mercer reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed evidence folder marked confidential. He explained that today's visit was not about honoring old service. It concerned unfinished business connected to that same mission. Recent intelligence suggested that one individual believed killed during the evacuation had actually survived. For years, that person had disappeared beneath false identities, while quietly building connections to an international criminal network involved in trafficking medical technology and humanitarian supplies. Several captured operatives had recently mentioned one detail investigators could not ignore. They repeatedly referred to a woman they feared, someone they believed could recognize the missing operative instantly if she ever saw him again. Captain Evelyn Hayes. Mercer carefully opened the folder and slid a single photograph across the polished table. Everyone instinctively looked toward it, but only Evelyn truly understood what she was seeing. The photograph showed an older man entering an airport terminal, wearing ordinary clothes, carrying nothing remarkable except a weathered black duffel bag. To everyone else, he appeared forgettable. Evelyn's breathing slowed almost imperceptibly. She studied the angle of his shoulders, the scar near his left ear, and the slight bend in two fingers that had healed incorrectly years before. Her face remained calm, but the color drained from it. She closed her eyes for one heartbeat before opening them again. When she finally spoke, her voice carried quiet certainty rather than fear. "That isn't the man you think you're looking for." Every person around the table leaned forward. Mercer asked what she meant. Evelyn lifted her eyes from the photograph and answered with words that instantly changed the investigation. "You're searching for the courier. The real mastermind is already here. Inside this hospital." The room seemed to lose all sound as the impossible realization settled over everyone, and somewhere beyond the conference room doors, completely unaware that years of hidden history had just collided with the present, footsteps echoed steadily down the hospital corridor toward the emergency department. The first sound anyone noticed after Evelyn's warning was not shouting or running, but the distant squeak of a supply cart rolling across the polished hallway, ordinary enough that it almost mocked the gravity of what had just been revealed. Every instinct inside the conference room urged people to move immediately. Yet for one suspended moment no one did. The realization that a dangerous figure might already be walking through the same corridors as recovering children, exhausted nurses, and anxious families froze everyone in place. Special Agent Mercer recovered first. He quietly instructed his partner to secure every public exit without causing panic. There would be no alarms, no armed officers rushing through waiting rooms, no evacuation unless absolutely necessary. A frightened crowd inside a hospital could become as dangerous as any criminal. Evelyn stood, clipped her hospital badge back onto her uniform, and calmly picked up a patient chart from the table beside the door. Dr. Lawson stared at her in disbelief. "You're going back to work?" he asked before catching himself. Evelyn looked at him with the same steady expression she had worn all day. "Patients still need their nurse," she replied softly. Then she added something Mercer understood immediately. "The safest place for me to disappear is exactly where everyone expects to find me." The FBI agents exchanged a quick glance before nodding. She was already thinking several steps ahead. Within minutes, the emergency department resumed its familiar rhythm, at least on the surface. Nurses distributed medication. Physicians reviewed scans. Families waited beside vending machines, unaware that federal agents in plain clothes had quietly blended into the hospital's visitors. Hidden earpieces carried whispered updates, while security personnel casually repositioned themselves throughout the building. Evelyn moved naturally between treatment rooms, never once looking over her shoulder. Anyone watching would have seen only an experienced trauma nurse beginning another busy evening. Yet her eyes noticed everything. A janitor pushing a mop bucket, a volunteer delivering flowers, a delivery driver carrying oxygen cylinders, a nervous visitor repeatedly checking the hallway behind him. Years of military medicine had taught her that danger rarely announced itself. It hid inside ordinary moments. Linda eventually caught up with her near the pediatric wing. She wanted answers, but the questions disappeared the moment she saw Evelyn comforting a frightened little boy waiting for stitches. The child clung tightly to a faded stuffed dinosaur, his lower lip trembling as tears rolled down his cheeks. Evelyn knelt until they were eye level and quietly asked if the dinosaur had ever protected him from monsters before. The boy nodded. Then perhaps today, she smiled. The dinosaur might let her borrow a little courage. The child slowly placed a toy into Evelyn's hands. Within minutes, he was laughing while she wrapped a colorful bandage around his arm. Linda watched from the doorway, suddenly realizing that nothing about Evelyn's kindness had been an act. Captain or nurse, classified missions, or ordinary hospital shifts. This was simply who she was. As Evelyn handed the dinosaur back, her eyes briefly lifted toward a man sitting alone across the waiting area. He appeared completely ordinary. Mid-50s, gray jacket, reading glasses, a hospital visitor's badge clipped neatly to his pocket. He smiled politely when their eyes met before returning to the magazine resting on his lap. To almost anyone else, he would have disappeared into the background. Evelyn noticed instead that the magazine had not been turned once in nearly 20 minutes. His shoes carried dried red clay inconsistent with the city's pavement. His wedding ring had left a pale mark on his finger, yet the ring itself was missing. Small details, harmless by themselves. Together, they formed a pattern she had learned never to ignore. She continued walking without changing pace, quietly informing Mercer through a concealed communication device the FBI had provided only minutes earlier. Possible contact, near pediatric waiting. Gray jacket. No sudden movement. Mercer acknowledged the message, but instructed every nearby agent to hold their positions. They still lacked confirmation. If they acted too quickly, the real target might disappear forever. Time stretched painfully. Every second felt louder than the last. Then another emergency shattered the fragile calm. An elderly woman collapsed near the hospital cafeteria, sending visitors rushing toward her. Nurses responded instantly. So did Evelyn. She reached the woman first, checking her airway while directing nearby staff with calm authority. Oxygen. Blood pressure. Clear the hallway. Her voice remained controlled despite knowing the suspected criminal sat less than 30 yards away. The man in the gray jacket watched the commotion for only a second before quietly standing and walking away in the opposite direction. Mercer saw him move through surveillance feeds. Agents began shadowing him from a distance. Evelyn stayed beside the unconscious patient until another physician arrived to continue treatment. Duty came before pursuit. It always had. Nearly 10 minutes later, Mercer intercepted Evelyn outside an imaging suite. His expression revealed frustration. The gray-jacketed visitor had intentionally led surveillance teams through several crowded corridors before disappearing into a restricted maintenance area. Security footage showed him removing the visitor badge and changing jackets inside a storage room. He had anticipated being followed. Mercer asked if she had recognized him. Evelyn shook her head. No, he isn't the mastermind either. He's creating time for someone else. Before Mercer could respond, Evelyn's eyes drifted toward the intensive care wing. Her breathing slowed. Everything suddenly aligned inside her mind. The photograph, the courier, the distraction. The hospital itself had never been the destination. It was the meeting place. Someone inside the building possessed information worth killing for. She asked Mercer one question. Where are the surviving aid workers from the convoy now? Mercer answered immediately. Most entered witness protection years ago. Except one. He stopped speaking as realization struck him with equal force. A retired humanitarian surgeon had been admitted to this very hospital 2 days earlier, following heart complications under his legal identity. His true history had remained sealed. Until today. Evelyn did not wait for further discussion. She turned and walked swiftly toward the cardiac intensive care unit, neither running nor hesitating. Panic would only draw attention. Behind her, Mercer ordered every available agent to converge on the same floor. The hospital remained blissfully unaware that its quiet corridors had become the final stage of a story that had begun 7 years earlier in a distant war zone. As Evelyn approached the intensive care doors, she noticed something that made every instinct inside her sharpen. A nurse she had never seen before exited the patient's room, carrying an empty medication tray. The uniform was correct. The identification badge looked authentic. Yet the woman held the tray with her dominant left hand while reaching for equipment placed naturally for a right-handed clinician. Tiny inconsistency. Almost invisible. The disguised nurse glanced toward Evelyn for only an instant before calmly continuing down the hallway. Evelyn stopped walking. The woman stopped as well. For several endless seconds neither moved. Then Evelyn spoke with quiet certainty that carried through the silent corridor. You're not here to save a patient. The disguised nurse slowly smiled, and in that chilling expression Evelyn recognized not the face itself, but the same cold confidence she had seen years ago, just before innocent lives were nearly lost. At that exact moment the cardiac monitor inside the protected patient's room erupted into a violent alarm, and every second suddenly became the difference between life and death. The shrill cry of the cardiac monitor cut through the hallway with terrifying urgency, and for a single heartbeat every person nearby seemed to move in a different direction. Nurses rushed toward the patient's room, visitors stepped back in confusion, and FBI agents reached instinctively beneath their jackets without drawing attention to themselves. Evelyn did none of those things. She watched the disguised nurse instead, Years earlier, she had learned that in moments of carefully planned chaos, the loudest emergency was often meant to hide the quietest escape. The woman standing across the corridor never looked toward the alarm. She looked only toward the nearest exit. That was enough. Evelyn stepped into her path with the same calm composure she had shown throughout the day. There was no anger in her face, no dramatic challenge, only quiet certainty. The disguised nurse smiled faintly, as though recognizing an old opponent whose reputation had never been exaggerated. Without warning, she dropped the medication tray. It clattered across the polished floor, syringes scattering in every direction. Several staff members instinctively looked down at the noise. That single distraction was all she needed to slip toward the emergency stairwell. Evelyn followed immediately, not with reckless speed but with measured precision. She knew panic caused mistakes. Control created opportunities. Mercer and two agents closed in from opposite directions, carefully steering confused hospital employees away from the unfolding pursuit without alarming the patients. The woman pushed through the stairwell door and began descending rapidly, but Evelyn did not chase blindly. She paused for one brief second, studying the narrow concrete space. The footsteps echoing below were too steady, too controlled. It was another diversion. She quietly climbed one flight upward instead. Mercer, realizing she had changed direction, trusted her instincts and redirected his agents without asking questions. At the next landing, Evelyn stopped outside a service corridor, connecting administrative offices to the rooftop elevator. The door slowly opened. The disguised nurse emerged, surprised to find Evelyn already waiting. Neither woman spoke. The silence between them carried years of unfinished history. Finally, the stranger laughed softly. She admitted that military reports had never captured the most dangerous thing about Captain Hayes. It was not her leadership or her medical skill. It was the fact that she always understood people before they understood themselves. Evelyn answered gently that she had simply spent enough years watching fear wear different faces. The woman reached into her pocket. Every nearby agent prepared for the worst. Instead of a weapon, she removed a small encrypted flash drive. She held it between two fingers before saying that dozens of powerful people would destroy lives to keep its contents hidden. Names, financial networks, stolen humanitarian aid, medical supplies diverted from refugee camps, entire communities abandoned because greed had proven more profitable than mercy. She smiled again and asked Evelyn a question that had haunted countless good people throughout history. If exposing the truth placed innocent families in danger, was the truth still worth telling? For the first time since the FBI had arrived, Evelyn did not answer immediately. She looked beyond the woman through the hospital window, where the evening sky glowed with fading gold. She remembered frightened children lifted into helicopters years earlier. She remembered exhausted medics who had never returned home. She remembered promises made beside hospital beds where strangers became family, simply because someone had refused to leave them behind. Then she spoke quietly. Truth without compassion becomes another weapon. Compassion without truth becomes another lie. We protect people by carrying both. Before anyone else could react, the disguised nurse lowered her hand. Her shoulders relaxed. Years of running had finally exhausted something deeper than her body. She admitted she had never intended to kill the retired surgeon. The cardiac alarm had been triggered remotely to draw everyone away while she escaped. She had come only to deliver the flash drive, because too many powerful allies had become dangerous enemies. She no longer trusted anyone except the one officer whose decisions had once saved civilians instead of sacrificing them for convenience. Mercer cautiously accepted the drive, while agents peacefully secured the woman without force. There were no dramatic takedowns. No gunfire echoed through the hospital. The greatest victory that evening came because someone chose restraint when violence would have been easier. Moments later, Evelyn hurried into the intensive care room. The elderly surgeon had already stabilized after doctors corrected the false monitor readings. He looked toward her with tired recognition, though decades had softened both their appearances. He smiled weakly and whispered that he always suspected she would find him if the past ever returned. Evelyn gently adjusted his blanket before checking his pulse. With the same careful attention she offered every patient. She replied that this time he could rest because the running was finally over. Outside the room, the atmosphere throughout the hospital slowly shifted as fragmented rumors became astonishing truths. Staff members learned that the quiet nurse who had worked weekends, covered difficult shifts, comforted grieving families, and accepted unfair criticism without complaint had once commanded one of the most extraordinary humanitarian rescue missions in military history. Yet what surprised them even more was what had not changed. She still thanked housekeeping staff by name. She still stayed late to comfort frightened patients. She still carried extra snacks for families waiting through long surgeries. Captain had never been the title that defined her. Nurse had never been a role beneath her. Service had always been the constant thread connecting every chapter of her life. Dr. Lawson found Evelyn alone near the emergency department just before dawn. The waiting room had finally grown quiet. Cleaning crews moved silently through empty corridors, while sunlight slowly replaced fluorescent reflections in the windows. He stood awkwardly beside her for several seconds before speaking. Throughout his career, he had believed confidence meant never admitting mistakes. Looking at Evelyn now, he realized true strength required exactly the opposite. He apologized sincerely for humiliating her in front of the staff. He confessed that his pride had nearly blinded him to someone whose judgment had saved both a teenager's life and perhaps many more that night. Evelyn accepted the apology without hesitation. She did not mention rank. She did not remind him of the embarrassment he had caused. She simply smiled gently and said that hospitals were full of people carrying invisible battles. The safest choice was always kindness, because we never knew which burden another person had carried before walking through the door. Linda quietly wiped away tears after hearing those words. They spread through the hospital in the days that followed, repeated by nurses during impossible shifts and remembered by young physicians facing difficult decisions. The strongest people are often the ones who never need anyone to know how strong they are. The FBI investigation eventually dismantled an international network that had stolen hope from countless vulnerable communities. Yet the headlines never mentioned Captain Evelyn Hayes. Most reports praised anonymous investigators and classified cooperation. Evelyn seemed perfectly content with that. She returned to ordinary 12-hour shifts, changing dressings, calming frightened children, celebrating recoveries, and holding lonely hands during final goodbyes. New employees occasionally noticed the unusual respect shown whenever senior staff greeted her, but few ever learned the entire story. They only sensed that something extraordinary rested quietly beneath her calm smile. And perhaps that was exactly as she preferred it, because the greatest heroes rarely ask the world to remember their names. They ask only that someone else's tomorrow becomes a little safer than today. If this story reminded you that quiet acts of courage often change lives more deeply than loud displays of power, share it with someone who believes kindness still matters. Somewhere in a hospital corridor or an ordinary workplace, another hidden hero may already be walking past unnoticed, carrying extraordinary strength beneath the simplest uniform, waiting for nothing more than another chance to help.